The 24-Carat Buddha and Other Fables, Stories of Self-Discovery by Maxine Harris, Publishing Company, Sidran Institute Press, Baltimore, Maryland. Just one string. A long, long time ago, before there were computers or typewriters, or even paper and pens to write with, people recorded the events of their lives on elaborate cloths called lifelines. Every child was given a plain cloth at birth by the clan chieftain, and the child's parents made the first marks on the lifeline by stitching on the exact time of the child's arrival on Earth and recording any noteworthy events surrounding the birth. From then on, family members would add marks or stitches or designs until the child was old enough to assume the responsibility for recording his or her own story. At the end of a long life, a clan elder might have a lifeline that was decorated with all manner of charms and relics and embroidered with brightly colored string, telling of births and deaths, triumphs and defeats, as well as the everyday struggles of living in a village near the ends of the earth. Gayla was only 12 years old, but she was already very proud of her lifeline. She had learned to stitch and sew from her grandmother, who was an expert seamstress. So even when Gayla's lifeline told only of some small event, her stitching was careful and straight and greatly admired by others in the clan. Gayla thought often of her lifeline and of all the interesting designs she would add as the years went by. Shortly after Gayla's 13th birthday, the villagers heard rumors that a group of barbarians from beyond the hills were attacking and burning villages to the east. The clan leaders met and plotted how they would protect the village if the barbarians turned west and came after the grain and wine and other riches that were stored in vast silos all around them. The men talked of how they would fight and defend their families, and the women prepared for how they would douse the fires and keep their children safe. Everyone waited anxiously, hoping that the marauding tribe would spare the village. But then one day, the much-dreaded alarm was sounded. The attack had begun. Gayla's mother called to her daughter and told her to hide in the root cellar that had been dug under the house for storing vegetables from the recent harvest. Gayla grabbed her lifeline and her sewing box and did as her mother asked. The cellar was small and cramped, but there was enough room for one young girl to hide from the devastation that was about to begin. Gayla crouched in the cellar, clutching her precious cloth, and through the tears, she began to stitch the story of the attack. She stayed underground for many days, subsisting on the roots her mother had carefully stored to feed the family during the coming winter. She sewed, and she listened, and she tried not to think of what was going on above her. At first, Gayla heard shouts and hollers and the sound of swords and clubs beating against one another. But after a while, she heard nothing at all, not even the wind or the rain or the other natural sounds that were a part of everyday life in the village. After many more days in the cellar, Gayla decided that it was time to emerge from the safety of her hiding place and explore what was left of her village and her home. As she lifted the heavy door of the root cellar, she could see at once that her worst fears were realized. The home she had loved and shared with her family was now nothing more than a pile of ashes. Everywhere she looked was terrible devastation. The Central Assembly Hall, the Sacred Lodge, the complex of school buildings, and the rows of homes, all gone, all nothing more than smoldering embers, and not a person in sight. Gayla called out the names of her family and friends, but only the empty silence returned her call. Nowhere she looked was there any indication that the village had ever been inhabited. Gayla sank to the ground, clutching her lifeline, and began to sob. The world and the life she had known were completely destroyed. When she could cry no more tears, Gayla opened her swollen eyes and looked down at the cloth she was still clutching in her hands. "Thank the Holy Spirits for my lifeline," she thought. "The barbarians may have taken my family and destroyed my home, but at least I have my story." And with that, Gayla looked down at the cloth in her lap and began to remember the happy times she had shared with her family. After several more days of wandering through the remains of her village, Gayla decided that she must form a plan. She could not remain in her burnt-out home. The winter was approaching, and soon it would be impossible to live there without the support of her family and her village. She decided to pack up her lifeline and her sewing basket and some roots from the cellar and make her way east toward the hills. But where exactly should she go? And then she thought to herself, of course I will go to my godmother, Magda. She is the wisest woman I know, and she will surely be able to give me shelter and advise me about what to do. And, she smiled, it does not hurt that she is the most revered sorceress in all the land. After adding a few more stitches to her cloth, Gayla packed her few belongings and headed off while there was still sufficient daylight for traveling. After several hours of walking across open fields, Gayla turned into a dense forest where she planned to spend the night. But as she entered the cover of the tall trees, Gayla realized that the forest was thick with sharp brambles. The branches clawed at her face and tore her clothing as she made her way through the underbrush. After much struggling, Gayla was almost free of the worst of the jagged bushes when she felt a sharp tug pulling her back. Her precious lifeline had become snagged on a tall and angry-looking bramble. She tried to gently free the cloth, but the bush held fast. Finally, as it was growing dark, Gayla gave the cloth a sharp pull to free it from the bush. She heard a shrill tear as a part of her precious lifeline ripped away and remained impaled on the highest branch of the spiky bush. Gayla let out a cry, but she knew that there was nothing she could do. Part of her cloth was gone. She would have to guard the rest as she made her way to Magda's house, and perhaps her godmother would be able to help her repair what had been torn away. The next day, Gayla awoke early from a fitful sleep, and after a quick breakfast, continued on her way. She was traveling swiftly through the woods when she heard a low and sinister growl. When she turned to see where the sound was coming from, Gayla found herself staring into the yellow eyes of a lean gray wolf. Although she was startled, Gayla was not really frightened. She had grown up with wolves that prowled the perimeter of her village. They were usually quite content with the potatoes, corn, and yams the villagers left for them to eat. "Okay, Mr. Wolf," she began in a quiet voice. "I know you are hungry and are eager for the roots I have in my bag. I will gladly share my food with you." And with that, she reached inside her bag and threw the wolf a big, fat yam. But as she opened the bag, her cloth fell out as well. As the wolf grabbed for the yam, he bit into the edge of the cloth. "No, no," cried Gayla. "Spit that out. You are about to chew my lifeline." But the wolf was much too busy eating the tasty yam to heed Gayla's cries. She grabbed the edge of the cloth and tried to pull it free, but as she did, the wolf became frightened and turned to run, tearing off a large piece of the cloth as he fled into the woods. Gayla began to sob as she looked down at the tattered remains of her lifeline. The wolf had ripped away a very large piece of the cloth, and Gayla now held only a small part of what had been her story. "I must keep this cloth safe," she thought. "It is all I have left of my old life. I will tuck it inside my blouse and keep it close to my heart. I cannot lose any more of my cloth before I arrive at Magda's. I must hurry on my way." Gayla traveled for several more days and kept her lifeline secure inside her blouse. She had only one narrow stream to cross, and then she would be safely in the garden of her godmother. As she was about to take her final step onto the shore, Gayla slipped on a moss-covered rock. As she fell into the water, the swift current began pushing her downstream. Gayla struggled to recover her balance, reaching for branches on the shore and waving her arms over her head. As the water rushed over her, Gayla could feel her blouse being thrust up over her head. She looked up to see the last remnant of her cloth being carried over the rocks and into the rushing water. Gayla stretched her arm and reached with all her strength, grasping at the cloth, struggling to fight the current at the same time. Minutes went by, and when Gayla found herself thrown to the shore, far downstream from where she had first entered the water, she looked at her clenched fist. All that remained of her precious lifeline was a single red string. Gayla sobbed, and fell to the ground. Broken-hearted and exhausted from her journey, she fell into a deep and troubled sleep, not to be awakened until the next morning by the gentle touch of her godmother. "Oh, godmother," she cried at the sight of the old woman, "so many awful things have happened. My village has been destroyed, my family is gone, and I have lost my lifeline, all but this one string." Gayla blurted out her story amidst sobs and desperate gasps. There, my child. I know all that has happened. I have been waiting for you to find me. Come, I will get you some warm clothes, and we can talk." "But what about my string?" blurted Gayla. "I have lost everything." "We will talk of that too," said her godmother, as she took Gayla by the hand to lead her back to the house by the stream. Magda hoped that her goddaughter would calm down once she was inside the safety of the cottage, but Gayla was inconsolable. The loss of her cloth had brought back all the grief and sorrow of the last several months. Magda could see that her goddaughter would be unable to rest until something was done about her lifeline. "Here, my child, give me the single string that remains of your lifeline," the wise woman lovingly demanded. "But it is all I have," cried Gayla as she clutched the red string to her chest. "I will not harm your string," reassured Magda. "Just place it in my hand." The young girl took all that she had left of her precious lifeline and placed it tentatively in her godmother's warm palm. As the old woman closed her fingers around the single string, she lifted her hand to her lips and began to blow. As her breath grew stronger, Gayla could hear a soft whisper emanating from inside her godmother's closed fist. The old woman gave one more substantial puff of air and opened her hand. As she did, the voice of the string grew louder and more certain. The string began to tell the story of Gayla's life. It told of her birth and her family, of all her happy times, and finally of the attack on her village. The voice of the string told of all the events that Gayla had carefully sewn into her lifeline. "How is that possible?" cried Gayla. "How is it that a single string can tell my whole story?" "Why, my dear, all you need is just one string, for every part of us contains all that we are." Gayla reached for her string and held it to her heart. Her lifeline had been saved, after all. Just one string. Loss is one of the most powerful human experiences, and repeated loss can be devastating. When we lose a special relationship, a cherished possession, or a valued job, we can imagine that we have lost an essential part of ourselves, something we cannot recover. Yet no matter how much we lose, we cannot lose the essential thread of who we are. Memory remains the connection to our past, and even in a life that has been battered by pain and trauma, there are some memories of joy and contentment. The very act of remembering can be a source of strength and a triumph over the losses and assaults of the past. Recognizing that we remain ourselves no matter what the world takes away from us can be the first step in learning to live with the losses that inevitably come in every life.